I'm Lars de Wildt. I'm usually at a university in the Netherlands called the University of Groningen. I'm a cultural sociologist, which means that I study, I guess, how we derive meaning in culture out of, things like media. So I think most how we know the world and how it works is through media, right? We know our neighbors and our families intimately, but most of what we know about places outside of that direct bubble are through media. So most of my work has been on video games as kind of the largest cultural industry in the world that we have, right? It's often said that it sells more than movies and music combined. It's definitely an influential and important thing to study. I think my work so far has been about, how we see military action, how we, play with war as a form of entertainment. My first book was about religion and video games specifically, and I'm here at Kappas to kind of think further through one aspect that I think has been related to all of the topics I've studied, which is how we imagine the end of the world. And so at Kappas, I'm focusing on how video games not just represent the end of the world, right? So there's a lot of disaster movies and post-apocalyptic movies and music and all kinds of media that are just as influential and important in how we see our world ending, right? All the different scenarios we imagine there. But the reason I focus on games is because they give us not just a narrative representation, but also kind of a system, a logic for the ideas of how our world will not just end, but also potentially how it works now. And so the question I guess I'm posing centrally is not just how we imagine the end of the world, but how we are made to act within it. So what kind of subject positions do we rehearse? What kind of things do we see as so natural or so obvious that we rehearse as a form of entertainment and distraction when we imagine, let's say, a climate apocalypse or a zombie outbreak or a world-ending pandemic or a nuclear fallout, things like that. In my work, methodologically, I've done a lot of work with the people who make games, as well as people who play them. So I look at discourse, I look at interviews. This book, I'm trying to start with a very strong emphasis on the games themselves. So what do they present? To kind of give myself the time to look more broadly at what is the variation of ends of the worlds that we have? What's the variation of roles that we are expected to play in? And what are maybe some of those examples that are in the margins at like really boring apocalypses or apocalypses where maybe no humans are left at all, and the things that we don't see very often. So I'm trying to methodologically make space to focus more on those margins rather than the people who play or make the games this time. Getting interested in the apocalypse during my work on religion and games, where I saw that in all these kind of scenarios, like the scenario of Fallout, right, where much of American society in that case has been erased by nuclear fallout, and when people kind of come out of these bunkers to see a mostly empty America erased of much of the institutions, the governments, much of the systems that we take for granted in the 21st century, that they ended up forming forms of religion, that there was such a kind of desire to find meaning collectively in these fictional imaginations of the post-apocalypse, that religion was one of them. I think that was very much constrained by my focus then on religion. And so what I want to look now at in more detail is, beyond that one typical example of people looking for meaning together, right? Inventing new religions. There are other ways in which the world operates, of course. And I think the ways in which games like Fallout or The Last of Us or other famous post-apocalyptic games imagine how a society will work after its failure, after its erasure, says a lot about also how we think of the economy, for instance, as something that is just natural, that is just there. How we think about gender relations, how we think about which forms of life are worth living or worth protecting or worth grieving, or are perhaps, forms of life that are seen as worthless. I think what video games are really good at is not just giving you a story and a visual representation of what the world looks like after the end of the world, right? But of also giving you some kind of systemization of how the world works. And I mean works very literally, right? So we have to put in some work to operate a game. You can't just sit back and watch. And the game then kind of gives us an answer back about which actions work or not. So it gives us not just an idea of the end of the world, but it also gives a logic to that idea. And in the case of something like Fallout or The Last of Us, right, because these are the obvious kind of examples to refer to, that means that we're not just given a representation of a world after a nuclear fallout or a zombie pandemic, but we're given a system of ideas on how the economy will work after the apocalypse, about, again, which life is worth protecting and which forms of life are worthless or even dangerous. So much of what games do is not just storytelling, right? Which either way we remember fondly and it informs whether we enjoy a game or not. But these interactions with, the systems that games present kind of guide our actions. So it's not even necessarily in the sense of how much choice we actually have in games, which in games, much as in everyday life, we have very little of, right? But the fact that we feel somehow invested and responsible for our choices makes games meaningful, right? So when we talk about the biome and necropolitics of games, it's not so much about what we feel is good life to be protected, but about the actions that we are lent to take, right? So for instance, if I go to a sandwich shop and I know that dairy cows deserve a good life, but all the options are meat and I'm hungry, I will probably, not in that moment privilege a cow, right? A cow that is out of view and so on. And games provide a kind of microcosm of that kind of ethics and politics of life, especially when there's no real alternatives. So when it comes to necropolitics specifically, the question of which life is not worth protecting or is seen as dangerous or to be neglected becomes one of the central kind of actions of games. So most post-apocalyptic games, for whatever reason, include the use of violence and the use of protection of ourselves, right? The kind of emphasis on survival. And whether we're confronted with zombies or even in non-apocalyptic games, with enemies when we are a soldier, we never kind of stop to question like, hey, why are we there? Why are we in a wasteland? Why are we in, let's say, a military setting shooting these people? No, we just know that the game puts us in these situations, and so we do that. And so in short, when we think about the necropolitics of games, we are put into these kind of situations and subject positions that we didn't come up with. And I think it's a mistake to think about games as these radical choice machines where we have all this agency in ways that cinema doesn't give us or whatever. It's actually much more about being told that we have a choice, but being put in a subject position and feeling responsible for choices that we didn't really make ourselves. I think that is a very typical thing that games do that makes them paradigmatic for ideology in many ways. For me, studying the apocalypse is not so much about the question of how the world will really end, right? I don't know whether that's going to be a climate crisis or a bomb or a pandemic, but it's about how we imagine the apocalypse, and especially how we imagine the apocalypse for fun and as a successful commodity, right, in the kind of commercial entertainment economy. So these games make a lot of money, and there must be a reason for that, right? So we are somehow invested in imagining the end of the world and how we would play a role in that, that even assumes that we will be there to witness it, right? For most of us, we will not, right? Most of us will die, hopefully a peaceful death before that. And if the world ends, it's probably not going to include humanity for much of it after, right? So if there is a post-apocalypse, it's probably not a human, it's a post-human. What I'm interested in is how we imagine those people that remain and how we see the end of the world, or what, comes at the tail end of humanity, and what we take for granted in that. So if I see a setting in which people arise out of fallout bunkers to see, a destroyed wasteland 200 years after a war, and there is somehow still an economy of exchange there, of not of bartering, but of using a central currency, that says a lot about how we perhaps struggle to think past a capitalist economy, for instance, right? In the same way, if things like gender relations or speciesism or questions of race and so on are something that is not questioned after what is more or less a full reset of culture, right? What allows full reimagining of how society would work after full collapse, then that to me says a lot about how we imagine society, not just after the apocalypse, but also how we see it as functioning now. And so what I especially enjoy is playing apocalypses where there's no humans left. I like the post-human scenarios of Nier Automata, for instance, a Japanese game in which androids originally built to protect the human race find out that actually the humans are extinct and they have to look for meaning. I like Stray, which is about being a stray cat in a world that has no humans left, right? I like Tokyo Jungle, which is a game about Tokyo functioning perfectly well with nature retaking many of the great landscapes of Tokyo, but there's just no humans left. And I think that's not just a very interesting scenario, right? Because that's most of how the apocalyptic scenarios will work out, but it's also a kind of beautiful version of the world where we get to see it without all the humanity in it.